So thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope that you had a good lunch. It's usually always more challenging on the second day, so I hope that I can live up to the challenge. So what I'm going to share a little bit about is making data practical, and specifically, I've actually added on another line that says for business people. So I know that within the target audience, we have got a doctor here, which is very much in the data science area. But I think specifically, I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit more about how we can actually make data integration in a more pragmatic and a more business sense way. So it's not going to go with crazy kind of rocket science kind of stuff, but mainly about making sure that there are some low-hanging fruits that we can address. Yeah. So in terms of the agenda, what I'm going to talk a little bit about here, we're going to cover 3 areas. So we're going to talk a little bit about how typically marketers or any business people struggle when it comes to data integration. We talk a little bit about the different types of data that's available, and I'm cautious that we only have 20 minutes. Am I right to say that? Yeah. So if in the interest of time, if we're going to go a little bit too long into it, we might skim through that briefly, and then we can talk about it offline after the session itself. And how do we best put data set together to achieve some of the desired business outcomes? And in this specific instance, it's more about showing some very pragmatic, low-hanging fruits example, very, very tangible ones, yeah? Can I get a show of hands before we start? How many of you have actually experienced putting data together or has actually worked on integrating data together? Yeah. Right? Okay. So I'm going to share with you a little bit more about some of the experience that I had myself as well in terms of the challenges, yeah? And I'm sure some of you could have resonated very well with this as well. So from a challenge standpoint, one of the biggest challenges I feel, and a lot of which are based on my personal experience here, it's about where do I start? There's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of sources. The focus on which are the data sets that's relevant, which is not, has always been a big challenge for a lot of practitioners in terms of data integration. The other thing is, and this again on my personal opinion, I feel that a lot of times business practitioners, especially those with very technical backgrounds, would tend to try to over-engineer and try to overcomplicate things. A lot of which is trying to go a lot beyond what really necessarily is required. So that's my personal experience. The third challenge I like to share, and I think it's also another one that probably makes a lot of people that can resonate with when you do data integration, is trying to get the data to talk to each other, trying to find a common denominator so that you can actually bridge the data together. Because in silos itself, it's always very difficult to try to say, how is this data related to another? The other thing that's a big challenge as well is about the technicality versus the practicality part of stuff. So a lot of times we need to strike a balance between being very robust with our data analysis, right? So trying to put our data together, we want to make sure that there is a lot of scientific approach or robustness inside, go through very rigorous process. But having said that, that is one side of being technical, but I think the more important is really focusing on the pragmatic part of it. How practical is the data at the end of the day? How we're going to use it? That's something that's very important as well. Rubbish in, rubbish out. So I remember my very first exercise where I actually need to do data integration. So I was taking on an approach of more of like a market mix modeling. It's very painful for me because we are looking at a lot of historical data, and it's the first time that we're trying to do something like a market mix modeling together. We realized that a lot of data sets are actually not very adequate. Okay, so either they are missing data or data has not been collected in a very effective manner. And as a result of that, you will find that we start to come up with ideas on how do we substitute those data. A lot of which we use data proxies. And if you ask me, proxies sometimes can be reasonably useful, but sometimes it can actually bring us to a very dangerous area. So in this instance, what I'm trying to say here is that it's very important to get the foundations right. So a lot of times where the amount of data that get ingested in, it's actually not very credible and not very strong in some foundations, the outcomes can be very dangerous as well. Implementation. So from a business perspective, I think the biggest challenge at the end of the day when we look at all this is how do we feed that into the entire business, the business structure, the business model. You've come up with something fantastic, you've come up with something great, how do we actually implement it? So a lot of times I see that a lot of practitioners, especially those who are the core group or the core team working on the data integration, or the analysts or the insights people or the data scientists who's putting the data together, they kind of really putting a lot of effort in terms of trying to put that piece together with the entire business in terms of its the business model and the business structure. A lot of times that becomes a challenge because you're almost forcing a square into a circle, right? The other thing I like to talk about is actionability. So, it's a very much cliche word everybody talks about, how do we make actionable insights. But as cliche as it is, it does make sense, and there's good reasons why people tend to overuse it. The reality is that at the end of the day, when we look at a data set, how do we actually implement it? That's always a big challenge as well. Last but not least, and I think that's something actually very important, is about the cost versus benefit. So if you ask me, my very first exercise, I've actually tried to do a data integration in my early years of my career. What I realized is that the amount of time and amount of effort that we put in terms of putting, gathering your data, aggregating the data, and then trying to make sense out of it, the output of it does not necessarily kind of weigh out very effectively, because from the benefit that we see, and especially with the challenges that we face in terms of implementation, working with management, stakeholders to try to get it into the process of the business, sometimes just doesn't seem to worth the effect of it. But having said that, that doesn't mean that it's the end of the world, so I'm not trying to paint a very pessimistic picture from the start. It's just kind of set expectations, since one of the event organizers actually want to make sure that I cover a topic about what it's all, data integration doesn't necessarily mean it's a beautiful picture. So that's how I would like to start off the conversation, yeah. And like I said, in the interest of time, I'm more keen to show you what the practical side of data integration can look like, the low-hanging fruits, the kind of, doesn't really require rocket science, but the low-hanging fruits kind. So I'll try to skim through this portion, and like I said, if you'd like to have my slides, I'm not sure, is this going to be available on some website? Yeah. So you can get those slides from the conference site, I would assume, after this, or if not, feel free to hang around and we can speak about it later on. So I'm going to skim through this portion a little bit, because it's quite tech-savvy, and it's pretty much some of the stuff is quite mediocre. So in terms of the data sources, I'm sure you can see that you have data sources from the mainstream media, CRM data that you can play around with, social media, web, online, market research, mobile, even geolocation data. This is something that is very much in the hype. Sales and inventory data, and along with so many other different sets of data that you can imagine playing around with. So over here, with all these data sources, you can definitely see some of the pros and cons about all the different data here. And like I said, in the interest of time, I'm going to skim through this section very quickly. So with the mainstream media, in terms of data sources, you can see that there's a lot of pros that comes across, whereby those are coming from more credible sources. It tends to be able to bring you some of these mass impressions, and actually understanding how some of these public outlets, media outlets, actually are framing people's mind. From a con perspective, is that mainstream data has a lot of limited metadata. There's a lack of perspective in terms of what's really going on the ground, right? In terms of the authenticity of people's mass audience perception. From a social media standpoint, the advantage of this is that you get data that's unprompted, they're unaided, they share with you very much a retrospective view of what's going on, so you can always look at data that's last 3 months or even a year ago, and you can know where did your brand stand probably a year from back then, right? So that you can always uncover this very quickly. And I think the other thing great about social media data is that you tend to be able to pick out a lot of unknown unknowns, things that you probably would not have hypothesized, and you might be able to find some small gold nuggets of information there. The downside about social media data is unstructured, so it's very difficult for you to take a very traditional statistical kind of analysis approach towards analyzing social media data. And obviously, you don't know who is the individual behind the social media platform, so limited demographic background. Online and web, very quickly as well. So you're on online platform, the advantages, you can kind of see what are the typical web traffic that you can get from there, the sources, very kind of standard stuff. What it doesn't take into account is the offline activations that happen. So you do not actually see the whole entire holistic view if you're looking at a purchase cycle, for example. From market research perspective, the great thing is that you have got structured data, so you can do very good analysis. You can even apply statistical approach towards it. The problem is that with survey data is that it works on a very big level of assumption of the researcher itself. So the kind of information that you ask, the questions that you ask could be very much limited to the market researcher's experience or the questions that they are forming. Right, moving on very quickly. So on the data sources around CRM, I think the great stuff is you can know your customers' buying behavior, the transaction patterns, even the demographics. What it lacks of is that you don't know those people who are not your customers, right? From a sales and inventory standpoint, the great stuff is that you know what are the actual sales performance that you can get out of it. But the not so great side about it is that you do not know what are the actual key drivers that's driving all those purchases. Geolocation, great stuff is the foot traffic and who are going, what are the time of traffic, etc. The not so great stuff is you don't know what are the kind of motivation, the kind of conversations that goes in terms of going to those destinations. From a mobile perspective, it's great to know the mobile behavior, how frequently they use certain apps, the behavior in terms of whether it's more productivity skewed, work skewed, or is it for more of a play environment. But having said that, what you can get to get those insights, it actually lacks a lot of information about what are the things that they do when they are not on the mobile platform itself. So this very quickly gives you a bit of context in terms of some of the pros and cons of the data that's available to you in the market, in terms of available to yourself internally as well, and how you can mix and match them together. Yeah. So this is the part that I like to share a little bit more, and I think that's the part whereby I like to show most of the low-hanging fruits, the use cases that we have seen in the past, whereby it does not really require rocket science or sophistication, but you can actually get some very tangible outcomes from it. To give you a classic example, and before I actually move there, I just want to share that regardless of data sources that you're actually using, I think the key is that you really need to focus on what the objective of this particular data integration you're trying to do. Like, what are you specifically trying to get out of it? And that ties very nicely and very importantly towards the outcome. So you need to kind of have a projection of what you intend and what you imagine the outcome will look like and how you're going to use it. So I think that's, if you ask me in terms of best practices, before we establish some of the use cases, is to make sure that we cover this as a prerequisite. Yeah. So to start off with an example of a very simple data integration, which is using social media data and mainstream data, and when you start integrating them together, what kind of benefits you will get out of it. So if you think about it, from a mainstream data perspective, on its own, what you see most of the time is that you can see a lot of news about new initiative that's being launched. If you are in the public sector, it could be about some of these policies that's being made. If you're in the private sector, it could be selling some new products, it could be business communications, brand communications, etc. So that's what kind of information on its own you see. And if you look at social media data on the other side, which is very similar, same topic that we are just talking about on the left-hand side, we talk about the same thing like in Singapore. It's about the PSLE system, talking a little bit more about the dengue issues that we are facing here, or even talk about the bank itself. You see that the other spectrum, on its own, they're talking about different topics. Now, when you start to synergize the two of them together, you can get a lot more richer insights and understanding out of it. So for example, in this case, when you bridge mainstream data and social media data together, you can start to understand questions whether are some of the key messages and the leading conversations that has been put onto the mainstream media platform, has it been effectively cascaded and communicated down to the social media? Does the mass audience actually understand what is the message that you're trying to drive across? Right? And is there a disconnect between what you're trying to push out? If you're a PR practitioner, what are the conversations or the key message you want to push out? Is it been a disconnect with the public in terms of understanding from a social media perspective? So with that, what happens is a lot of times, a classic example of this is that you can start pairing up some of the key messages that you want to drive. So from a PR perspective, the media outlets have been pushing out. So you imagine yourself being in a situation that you have got 4 key messages that you want to push out to the public, be it whether it is on mainstream or social media. Let's just see whether the mainstream outlets are actually doing the same kind of key messages that you have highlighted. And then again, you see whether from a social media's perspective, which is a mass audience, are they actually picking up the same messages? So from this perspective, what you have done here is actually a message gap analysis. You can actually identify what are the conversations that's happening on the mainstream vis-a-vis that goes in social media. And one of the very actionable points from this very simple exercise is that you can start taking corrective measures as you go along when you start to look at your communications with the masses. So if the mainstream outlets are not kind of pushing those messages that you have been trying to drive, you can actually start to educate them through new press releases, communications with the journalists or whatnot. And from a social media standpoint, you do the same thing. If you see the messages has not been cascaded down, what is the things that you need to do to change those perceptions, so and so forth, right? So this is an example of how data integration will look like when you put the social media and the mainstream data sets together. Other users around using mainstream data and social media data, it's actually to understand where's the best platform for you to actually do your communications. So for example, in certain industry like automotive, you will see that positive coverage tends to be a little bit more favorable towards the press versus the online. So you kind of know where you kind of put your emphasis. Same thing for another industry, retail, but the direct opposite, you actually see that the coverage online tends to be a little bit more positive versus the offline environment. When it comes to utilities, social media tends to be more effective. So if you think about it, going back to what I've just mentioned earlier on, if you start looking at mainstream information as well as social media information in silos of each other, you will not be able to piece the big picture together. You will not know where to put most of your effort and where should your communications bring you more value in this instance. So when you kind of enrich data in a very simple exercise like this would have actually give you a lot of low-hanging and immediate actions out of it, yeah? The other one I want to share is social media and CRM data, trying to piece the two of them together, kind of things that you see. And you'll realize that I'll put quite a fair bit of emphasis, by the way, onto social media data just because of the fact that it's actually in a very, obviously, the hype of most of the conversations that's happening these days. So CRM data on its own, what you'll probably see is that you will be able to find out demographic data, pretty no-brainer, right? Contact information, transaction sales. This is how it looks like on its own. And if you look at social media data on its own, you'll learn a lot of things about engagement. What are the things that people like, things that people don't like, the comments, the shares, etc. So standalone data, if you're doing some sponsored posts, you'll probably be able to find some analysis out of it as well. But that's pretty much how it looks like if you were to look at this data on its own. But when you start integrating them, the data gets a lot more richer. So the moment you're able to put Facebook into your CRM, tag it together, whereby, for example, a very simple way of doing this is that you actually get people to log in into your CRM using their Facebook login instead of an email login, you'll start to be able to track some of this information that's going on around the Facebook activities that they do. So in this instance, what you can actually get out of it is that you can actually start seeing what are some of the things that they like on your pages. Whether if you're putting out certain contents, what are the content that actually seems to get more interactions with them. If you're selling certain kind of fashion wear, in this case of Topshop, for example, are they more into casual wear, formal wear? And as a result of this, it becomes very useful because when you're doing your direct targeting, right, you can actually send them more relevant information as opposed to sending them casual wears kind of promotions or incentive. You should be sending them more formal wears because those are the things that actually gets them to like and engage with you, right? Those are some of the examples of really trying to get some low-hanging fruits out of the integration of CRM and social data. So on this, another example I can show, and I think this is an example of some of these companies like Zalora as well as Lazada who can do very well is the moment you start shopping on their mobile apps or on their website, right? And if you actually log in using your Facebook data, what very quickly is that it's a matter of minutes, and by the way, I specifically did this exercise just for this conference, and it's a matter of less than 2 hours, it starts popping on your Facebook pages in terms of reminding you some of the things that you have put on your shopping list or your wish list, and how it actually puts onto your Facebook sponsored post to remind you and try to entice you into buying. So again, it's through the integration of those data sets that allows you to do this. It's the same thing for Zalora as well. Now, coming on to talk more about the CRM portion is, in essence, what I'm trying to say here is that once you understand your customer base in terms of the content that they are into or the things that they are interested in, be it whether it's the activities they do, the food that they like, the movies that they watch, you can start to interact with them in a more targeted way. So through the pages that they like on the Facebook pages, through the kind of TV shows or the books that they claim that they enjoy on Facebook as well, what happens is that when you start sending them EDMs or direct mailers, you can actually send them, instead of a shotgun approach of shooting everyone on the same kind of products or solutions, you go in a very customized way with one group of individuals. You send them things or books in this instance, for example, based on the activities or the genres or the things that they like in this instance. So it's very, very targeted, and you're trying to get more interest there. And just cautious of time because they reminded me that I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to go through this quite very quickly. Social media and market research integration is another very good area as well. So what typically here, there's 2 general approaches that we take here. One example will be taking data fusion approach, whereby you do not actually tie that specific individual that you actually measure or try to track on the social media vis-a-vis the one that is on your survey. So long story short is that you kind of look at them from a mass perspective, right? The other way of looking at it is individual tracking, whereby what we are saying is that you're looking at individuals specifically who is actually on social media, as well as getting him to do a survey subsequently or prior, so that you can actually look at them as a unique individual. So this is a typical way that you can actually integrate social media market research data together. What typically comes out of it is that on its own, market research tends to be very demographic rich, but very psychographics poor. So there's a lot of things that you might not be able to get out of it. On the contrary, on the social media side, it tends to be very demographics poor, and it's very psychographics rich. And when you start putting the 2 pieces of puzzle together, what you kind of get is that you are able to kind of do a lot of new solutions. A classic example here that I'm trying to talk about here is identifying needs. So in the case of what I have here is a little quadrant, very quickly sharing what the x-axis basically means. So on the y-axis here basically is talking about the level of importance, high versus low. On the x-axis here is about satisfaction on low versus high. So what we're trying to say here is that when you put social media and market research data together, you will be able to find an opportunity of identifying what we call as the unknown unknowns. So basically, people might be talking about experience. So think about 10 years ago when all apps and iOS are readily available. People look at bus schedule, looking at the newspapers or through the handouts or the leaflets that they have, or going to the bus station looking at the postboard there. But through the conversations with listening through social media, you will find out that people has a wish list of how good if they would be able to access these bus schedules very readily available. And therefore, probably it's a good gap to develop an app specifically looking at bus schedules. Of course, today we have a lot of apps out there that has really got bus schedule. But my point here is that it's the same principle. Identifying the pain points, things that are probably unmet by the industry these days, and trying to kind of create a solution for it. But the problem is that on a social media platform, it only tells you what is the pain points, but it doesn't tell you who they are. So matching it together with market research and surveys data, you'll be able to get a holistic picture of it. Yeah. And very quickly finish on my last example before I kind of wrap things up. Is comparing social media and web analytics data together. This is one of the low-hanging fruits that I always talk about, and I cannot imagine how much business tangible value come out of it. To give you a quick example, imagine on its own, on social media, you look at it, and this happens most of the time in a lot of our organizations. If you have a social media team, and then you have another team that does look after the online, and if they don't talk to each other, they will see things in a very separate way. So from a social media online platform, if the social media team sees that, oh, a large chunk of my traffic is coming from Twitter, I should have invest more money on Twitter and try to get more, the conversations going. That could be one perspective you'll see it. And then if you look at it, if you imagine yourself to be an online or web manager looking after the website of the company, you see that the chunk of the conversation is coming from Facebook, and you say, hey, maybe I should invest more money in that particular area as well. But when you start integrating some of this data together, when you start getting some of these companies and teams to come together and start working in silos, you'll find that there's a lot of interesting things that you can do. For example, you can optimize the traffic that goes to your website. Very simple, low-hanging fruit stuff is that if you realize that there are 43% of the conversations around your brand on the Twitter platform, you should be actually trying to convert that and move the conversations to the websites, because it's only generating 2.77% of the traffic that's going through. So small little things like this, and the recommendation comes through very, very low-hanging. First of all, you just probably need to make sure that there's a call to action to make sure that you can drive traffic from Twitter to your website. The second thing is to make sure that there's a URL conveniently available for the consumers to click on it. So these are some of the basic examples that you can imagine when you look at data integration. Yeah? And like I said, wrapping things up in terms of some key takeaways, I think there isn't such a thing as really a silver bullet in terms of data integration. There's always pain points, but it's more about what really works. Typically, there are kind of two approaches that I would suggest if you ask me for my personal opinion. One is be very exploratory. So you kind of start from a bottom up, whereby you look at what are the data sets that you have, you start experimenting with it and see really what comes out of it at the end of the tunnel. The downside of this is that you are not really very much focusing on a defined goal. So you don't know what comes out of it, so there's nothing very definite there. The good side of it is that you're playing with very robust data, you're not restricted by what's available and what is not. The other approach I look at it is that don't let the data sources dictate how you should be doing your research in this instance, right? You work backwards, you identify what are the things that you want to achieve, right? You kind of set some goals and what you want to do, and then you find a data set. The downside of this is obviously the inverse, whereby you might not necessarily have all those data readily available, but there's a lot of missing data that you need to plug in. The upside of it is tend to be more impactful, because what happens is that you're identifying based on the business outcomes that you want to achieve out of it. Usually you might get your management, your leaders, stakeholders support in this instance, so it's definitely a little bit more engaging. My suggestion is always go for the easiest. So for example, some of the things that I've shared with you in terms of the data integration here, the point is that practitioners tend to overcomplicate the solutions. So what I'm trying to say here is start with some of the low-hanging fruits. It does not have to be all rocket science when it comes to integration. I would personally choose pragmatism over sophistication in this instance, just to get the process going. And last but not least, just to finish it off, integrate for the right reasons. Right? A lot of times, people are just integrating for the sake of following up with trends, trying to come up with more value out of things. But the way I see it is that it's trying to see how you can enrich your data so that you get more out of it than when it's on its own as a silo. Yeah. So that's what I'd like to share with you guys. Thank you very much for the session.
Thank you so much, Garick. If you have any questions for Garick, please find him after the session concludes. Thank you.